provincial government, and therefore should exempt us from federal drug laws. As you know, we won back in the Supreme Court of BC under the jurisdictional the constitutional argument. Hold your applause. We were appealed within 24 hours and then ended up in the BC Appeal Court several months later. At the BC Appeal Court, we appealed our loss of the jurisdictional case and then ended up winning twice. So not only did they uphold Pitfield's decision, but they also said, sure, we'll also rule in your favor on the jurisdictional issue. Feds, of course, didn't like either of those rulings and took us to the Supreme Court of Canada. I should mention that at the Appeal Court of BC, we were joined by the local health authority as an intervener. By the time we ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada, we had 11 interveners that we had collected along the way. Highly reputable organizations from across the country, including the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Nurses Association, public health officials from across the country, the Attorney General's Office of British Columbia, the province of Quebec, and on and on. It was quite a sight in the courtroom. There was about 34 robed lawyers on our side and about 4 fighting for the federal government, so it was pretty incredible. And we heard the case on May 12th, 2011.
I won.
Ah, wait.
One.
Next slide, please. Or I do that, I guess. Sorry, totally confused about the technology. So on September 30th, 5 weeks ago now, it seems like yesterday, the ruling was announced on the sidewalk, 6:40 in the morning, Vancouver time, where we gathered in front of Insight over a pancake breakfast. Many of you were there. Hundreds collected on the sidewalk to hear the verdict, and we won.
Made justice in a side order of common sense.
Tension was incredibly thick. Most of us felt sick to our stomachs because everything rode on this decision. By 6 o'clock, the sidewalk was packed.
Stay tuned there on Hastings. It's going to be a historic moment any minute now. It's been a long struggle up to this point. Let's all pray and keep our fingers crossed about the upcoming decision. Sit tight. It'll happen any second right now, okay?
It was like my hair was standing on end at that point. Dean was obviously very nervous about it. He was like walking around and fidgeting.
I found out because somebody came in from the back. I guess the CBC News had found out first, and the media informed one of our guys in the back room who came out and grabbed me and told me that we had won. And I just crumpled. My knees buckled and I fell into Shelley's arms and saw Brian crying, tears pouring down his face, and just felt so emotional I didn't think I could actually stand up.
Dean immediately just jumped up and went into the middle of the room of the Supreme Court building with his arms in the air. The relief and just joy of hearing the result just created a wave of jubilation over my whole body.
We won! There was a lot of whooping and screaming and shouting. Cars drove by honking. It felt like a giant community celebration. People came by and stopped and said congratulations. Everybody was hugging. I probably hugged 100 people that morning. It was just an incredible moment. It was momentous, really. So a question now that we're constantly being asked is, what does this mean for Canada? Well, I think most importantly, it means that we can stay open. Oh, that always makes me cry. It means that Insight can exist while it's still needed to exist. And it means that for us as a country, Canada has finally been forced to listen to the evidence that this is a strategy that works. So it's huge. However, the legal decision forcing the government to grant an exemption, while it does shine light on Insight and its value, does not negate the need for communities that are interested in developing and opening initiatives like this still have to work really hard to get them. A lot of things had to come together for Insight to open. Primarily, there has to be an appetite for people in the communities affected to address addiction differently. And I personally believe this starts with humanizing the very people who are affected, our families, and our communities. Insight does this, but it's up to us to put the stories and the people most affected front and center in every conversation that we have. It's not an issue about the right to ingest drugs into our bodies. It's an issue about our collective humanity and the future of Canadian society. To create sustainable community change, we have to listen to the people in our communities, groups that are affected and groups who often go with no support. It means working to educate policymakers on personal level, in the media, and it means working with healthcare professionals and taking every opportunity we have to present the need and relevance of what are perceived often as marginalized or alternative approaches. We also need to work with enforcement officials and politicians to get support, and we need to find ways of having the people who represent the power base amplify the voices of the people who often have no voice. And we need to work together to achieve a common goal. None of this happens overnight, and it takes a tremendous amount of strategic work and collaboration. Oh, sorry, I forgot to click. I am technologically impaired today.
Kathy.
What this means for us in Vancouver, hopefully, is now we can move on to our next set of priorities, and of course there's always more to do. In our community, I believe we need to open a second site. Given the pressure on Insight, people will leave if it's too busy, and obviously it's demonstrated the demand and the need. We need to alleviate backlog, we need to reach more people, we need to take more injections off the street, and just to provide more opportunities for people to gain access into treatment programs, methadone, and of course housing and basic health care. This next step has begun as we have a location lined up and secured, in addition to architectural drawings in place to convert a space. However, in many ways, in order to make this happen, we have to go back to another kind of a beginning. And while the legal argument has already determined that while the conditions are in place, they can't deny access to the types of supports, we still need the collaboration of the city, the province, and the police to open a second site, in addition to funding being made available and set aside against competing health authority priorities. And additionally, at Insight right now, there's no ability to allow inhalation drug user space. So while ventilation systems are in place and ready to go, this requires another exemption from our federal government to allow inhalation. We've made numerous requests. So now, in light of the court case, we're going to be following up on these a lot more closely. We also believe we need heroin maintenance to be approved and functioning in Vancouver, and we will continue to work with the experts who have been studying the Naomi and now the Salome trials, and attempt to potentially advocate more strongly for prescription heroin to be both embedded at Insight and across our system of care more broadly. Insight and the fight to save Insight represents hope for drug users individually and also for those of us who have made drug policy our focus. It is just a tiny thing, but we know it demonstrates a beginning that we can use to get people into housing and supports that they need and the whole range of other services. But most importantly,